If ever I'm put in charge of date and time, I'm going to eliminate the month of January. It's a depressing, miserable month, full of ice and suicide, but notably lacking any proper games being released. Since I'm not the author of ISO 8601, I have to make do with moaning about that fact, and what better to have a moan about than The Cave? It feels unfair to have a go at a Ron Gilbert game. After all, this is the man responsible for Maniac Mansion and The Secret of Monkey Island. It's just that, as Peter Molyneux also needs to learn, a good pedigree does not excuse a crap game in much the same way as being Prime Minister won't let you get away with war crime. Oh, right. Well, you still see my point. There were several problems with The Cave, chief among them the fact that every choice made throughout the game all comes to nothing if you don't do one obscure thing right at the end to get the proper ending. There's no excuse for that kind of lazy story designer. From a man with 20 years of experience under his belt, we frankly expected better. There's also the issue of having to play through the game multiple times for only slightly different stories, and cumulatively the impression I get of The Cave is a massive faff for little reward. Oh, Jesus, I nearly forgot, Ni no Kuni came out in January too. It is a much better game. Other than a story setup that's nothing short of depressing lunacy like a clown on smack, it's a gorgeous romp through a land lovingly laid out by the folks at Studio Ghibli, who you may recognise as the guys behind Spirited Away and Howl's Moving Castle. This is an example of a pedigree done right, because in addition to Ghibli's fantastic work, the actual game part was carried out by Level 5, developers of the brilliant Professor Layton games. This shows. The battle system is fluid and inventive. There's monster summoning, tons of side quests, wide open worlds, great dialogue, and even some good voice acting, which in Japanese RPG terms is like finding a hen's tooth in the stomach of a flying pig. With nothing else worth my precious breath coming out in January, let's talk about February, which was the greatest month ever because it was my birthday! Seriously though, tons of stuff came out that month, and we'll get to the games in a second, but there was one event which managed to overshadow everything before it, the climactic unveiling of Sony's PlayStation 4. Actually, shadow is a pretty appropriate term since we didn't get to see the bloody thing. Instead of looking at a console, we got to marvel at the controller, which is the same as the current one, only rounder and with a stupid touchpad in the middle, so I guess Sony really do steal ideas from Nintendo. Fire Emblem Awakening. When grid-based turn-based strategizing came to use 3 full eyeball-straining dimensions at last. This was followed a day later by Dead Space 3, which in giving every player a co-op buddy to hold their hand while they toddled along managed to strip out the dregs of horror the series was still pretending to cling on to. Then there was Brain Age Concentration Training, a 3DS game from Dr. Kawashima about teaching you to, do stuff and things. Ooh, Aliens! Yes, Aliens Colonial Marines flopped onto February and managed to take first place on the sales charts, which is both amazing and depressing only until you realise that bloody nothing else noteworthy would come out for another month. That's not to say it was any good either. In fact, it's probably one of the few games that Nintendo fans will be glad was never ported over to their console, since the Wii U is a shiny new machine and probably would have melted down the disc with its laser for the player's own benefit. Bad AI, terrible bugs and murky graphics didn't contrive to endear a game to anyone, which is the reason Crysis 3 did so well by contrast. And that, friends, is what I call a segue. Yes, people actually seem to like the latest installment in the series that used to be known as a graphics card killer until they failed to update the look for 6 years. Crysis 3 tried to go a bit stealthy, which is an odd style for a game about big blokes in power armor suits, but whatever, they made it work. Mainly by giving people bows and arrows. When the French knights of Agincourt were being stuck like pigs under a rain of English longbow fire, they must have taken some crumbs of comfort from how apparently stealthy les Anglais were being about it. Oh, and now you can hack everything. You can hack mines, you can hack turrets, you can hack security codes, you can hack at a keyboard to produce this kind of presentation, etc. It's like Bioshock, only you're hacking circuits instead of pipes, and people have stopped endlessly banging on about it. More on that later. Speaking of hacking of a different sort, Hideo Kojima's latest Swords and Cyborgs simulator was released in the form of Metal Gear Solid Rising Revengeance. The substance of the game, which involves chopping things from various angles as Raiden, the androgynous nude hero of Metal Gear Solid 2, doesn't matter next to the infuriating nature of the name. Now, you can call me a pedant if you want, and by the way, I definitely am, but I cannot wrap my head around the concept of devising the word revengeance just to stick it in the title for this game. Either Kojima, and it definitely sounds like it was his editorial decision, is going for the alliterative angle, in which case the word revenge already exists and does perfectly adequately, or he, for some reason, is fixed on using the word vengeance, in which case that's fine and he can put it in, nobody will care. What doesn't work is making up a term so utterly stupid that it overshadows every genuine critique of the game, with people arguing back and forth over the relative merits or not of the name, and that includes in very meta and self-aware segments of yearly internet videos in which they get irrationally angry about the thing. Right, March. Time for some puns. The Amazing Spider-Man wasn't, Lego City Undercover should have been kept covered up, and Resident Evil 6 was frankly diabolical. Still, unless you're a big opponent of fun, you should have been pretty pleased with the games on offer in March. Despite raising a certain unpleasant stink over an attempted rape scene depicted with characteristic levels of class and good taste, i.e. none, Tomb Raider worked out pretty well. The game's presentation was nothing short of breathtaking, and I was a big fan of the way Lara's hair swished around in the breeze in the same way I am a big fan of ponies in the colour pink. It pulled off the near miraculous feat of being a linear AAA title while not devolving into a vehicle for endless QuickTime events and slog. Well, I tell a lie, it had some QuickTime events and slog. It had narrative without necessarily railroading, and it's a story design for which I, and it seems the actual games journalists, were extremely grateful. The set-piece segments really showed what developers could do with their time, and despite some early fan misgivings over the rebooting of Lara's origin story, it was pulled off with uncharacteristic aplomb. Released on precisely the same day, and inflicting a mortal blow on certain games writers' bank balances, was SimCity, a brilliant city-building game marred only by totalitarian DRM and an insistence on being updated every 14.5 seconds because it didn't work. Oh, and the potential city-building size was bloody microscopic. A load of the features of SimCity 4 had been arbitrarily stripped out to make the game more accessible to noobs. The whole thing was plastered with product placement. It required Origin to run. The AI seemed to be living in some sort of communal system where they went home to a different house every night. The traffic system rammed single roads full of cars while side streets stood abandoned. And the emergency services were daft as a drum of dog shit and incapable of finding a fire despite the massive flaming husk of a skyscraper collapsing across the road. And yet, I said it's brilliant. That's 'cause it bloody well is. If you start building a little mining town, the experience of watching it flourish into a garish, crime-ridden metropolis scratches some sort of creative itch in the back of your mind and won't let you go until you've built every expansion to your city hall and have a population of over 1 million. It's like heroin, only more expensive. Oh, and occasionally the server kicks. More March merriment. There was The Walking Dead Survival Instinct, which had absolutely nothing to do with the excellent adventure games, except AMC's desire to wring as much money as possible out of the franchise. A pretty awful shooter, let's not discuss it further, except to say that nobody should ever play it under any circumstances. Then there was God of War Ascension, in which a burly man beats up burly enemies in disturbingly brutal ways. The brilliantly named Hyperdimension Neptunia Victory, a game, and I kid you not, about anthropomorphic representations of the three sides in the console war teaming up to fight anime-styled enemies in the kind of stupid genius only Japan can do quite right. See developers, it's stuff like this you should be making more of. Check this out.
Boss fight! Time to get excited! Processor unit installed! Processor unit installed! I've been Behold! Ah, that's not me.
Transformation complete.
I can transform, right?
Let's enjoy this to the fullest. I can handle the... That's it. I'll beat the crap out of you. Installation complete.
Yeah! Hey, hey! You! If you can dodge this, prove it!
Luigi's Mansion finally got a sequel in the form of Dark Moon on a timescale that makes Duke Nukem Forever look merely slightly delayed. It was actually pretty good, sending the cowardly second fiddle of a plumber to several mansions in an assault on all things ectoplasmic. But of course the month of March can't be mentioned without talking about the big one. The main game to come out right at the end of the month, inspiring millions of fans worldwide to revel in its compelling, complex narrative and inventive combat mechanics. That's right, it was Ms-Splosion Man. Oh, hang on, got my notes mixed up. Sorry. 1 second. BioShock Infinite! I won't give away too much of the plot, but really it's unlike anything else BioShock's ever given us. In fact, apart from stylistic references and one particular incident I won't mention for reasons of spoilers, it could be a game in a completely different series. The city in the sky, Columbia, is a world away from the oppressive dinginess of Rapture, and riding the rails with your skyhook in a way that would probably enrage some health and safety officials is genuinely just a joy to do. The real meat of BioShock Infinite is actually pretty standard. Combat remains done in pretty much the same way it has been throughout the series, with regular weapons in one hand and special powers in the other. Your partner Elizabeth helps by occasionally tossing you money, health or mana potions mid-fight while somehow managing to stay out of trouble herself, and for the most part this makes things rather easy. Still, it's not the combat that anyone's staying on this Skybourne city for. As with the best games, it's the little touches that matter. The world of Columbia is not a broken society at the game's start. Black people are still essentially slaves, there's a tremendous sense of nationalism and xenophobia running through the residents, and a small but growing anarchist movement is creating the first rumblings of trouble, but for the most part, society is functioning. This creates what might be one of the most compelling moral choices games have ever seen. Is it right to destabilise a civilization for the sake of what's morally correct, or is it better to encourage moderation and reform in the knowledge that such measures may take years to implement? Oh, who cares, let's kill some more steampunk robots. The presentation was consistently pretty good, and while the combat and large chunks of the story left much to be desired, the reveal at the end deserves applause for being clever and complex while still completely understandable. It's well worth playing even if you're not a series veteran, and with DLC trickling out there couldn't be a better time. After that mammoth of a month came April, a 30-day period I can only describe as being a complete letdown. Well, perhaps that would be unfair and petty, but I am, so I'll stick by it. There were some interesting things to note. I could talk about Don't Starve, a rather straightforward title describing quite a straightforward game. As you might expect, the object of the indie game Don't Starve is not to die. This is harder than that statement makes out. There are numerous factors which can prove deadly. The eponymous starvation, the standard enemies, and rather unexpected factor of insanity. Death is permanent, the open world is unforgiving, and it's entirely possible to slam down your keyboard and march off in a huff. Don't. Gaining experience over the course of many lives, expanding your character repertoire, and generally learning your way around the world and its mechanics are all part of the experience. The only other notable game in April was Monaco, What's Yours Is Mine, a clever and rare example of a multiplayer stealth game. Sneaking through levels as a team with different abilities, players must avoid guards while helping themselves to as much loot as possible. A simplistic top-down graphical style masks a complex interior, and the line-of-sight-based field of view is very well implemented indeed. Its soundtrack is catchy as hell, and that should be reason enough to try it at its current price, but in case you're still wavering, there's one special reason to single it out for praise. See, most stealth games have a problem of balance. Either they're so forgiving of player screw-ups and murder that they essentially turn into shooters with a visibility bar bolted on, or they're so utterly tough that proceeding past about level 2 requires a 15-week basic training course from fucking Mossad. Monaco gets it right. It's always best to keep yourself hidden, as any master thief would wish, but it's not impossible to escape if you do mess up. Alarms, sensors and guards have workarounds for if you want to brute force your way through. You'll have points deducted for each guard you knock out or blaring siren you have to hack, but of course some of us have clumsy hands and 2 left feet, so lay off. May marked its midpoint with the mention-worthy Metro Last Light. The Metro series manages to maximise its appeal by for once taking place in a rather original setting. The Moscow Metro after the nations of the world got together for a big nuclear showdown. Anyway, there's a lot of rather cool imagery, and the impression we get of a society that despite its apparent destruction still clings on in the vaults of the Russian wastes is certainly pretty moving. It's hard to imagine these people's plight, but Metro does its best and it's all the better for it. Have a look at this.
In the beginning, God said, "Let there be light to burn away the darkness." On the second day, the sky was born, a majestic canopy for the earth. On the following day, God sculpted the bountiful earth and planted it with trees. With the fourth day, God split day from night and blessed the earth with the cycle of the seasons. Then God filled the sea with life and set forth the birds to soar in the skies. On the sixth day, God created glorious creatures.
Unless you count the release of Resident Evil Revelations as a major event, and here's a revelation, it isn't, then the only other thing being unsheathed in May was Microsoft's Xbone. Before you become too horrified by the prospect of a nude Steve Ballmer, that refers to the Xbox One, Microsoft's massive black box full of fun, DRM and bees, and possibly one of those things is true. In a situation I'll describe as a PR apocalypse, the Xbox One was about as popular as a Christmas tree tax and inspired the kind of reaction you'd see if the National Socialist German Workers' Party announced that they were getting together for one last gig at Moscow's Luzhniki Stadium. Among the many complaints about the system's reveal were the need for Kinect to be connected all the time, which conjures up images of 2001's HAL laughing as you flail your flabby form around in Just Dance. Then there was the apparent requirement for the console to connect to the internet every time it was played. This doesn't sound too bad, but there are still a surprisingly large contingent of people who don't want to get on Xbox Live for outrageous reasons like not wanting to pay £40 a year to get screamed at by sugar-addled 9-year-olds teabagging their dismembered corpses on Call of Duty. The dissent on this one was mainly down to its lack of foresight. What happens if your internet goes down? No games for you. In fact, if you attend an institution like, to pick one completely at random, the University of Sheffield, it's completely impossible to hook up your consoles to the university network, so you'll essentially have bought a £400 paperweight, not that I'm bitter. Still, the Xbox 3, as it should properly be called, does have some cool features, not least of which is the extremely comfortable controller that almost makes up for the hand-twisting pain inflicted on buyers of the original console. It features an HDMI in port, a first for a console, which is ostensibly designed for hooking up cable boxes to the Xbone's interface, but 6 months down the line, rather hilariously, allows you to play PS4 and Wii U games on it. So much for competition. June is a great month for gamers since we get an early look at the cool stuff we'll be playing in the months to come, not to mention the cohort of blockbuster summer games released around the same time. The people it's not great for are budding games journalists in the library at 2 AM hammering a keyboard and jittering madly as a result of 4 cups of coffee and blind deadline panic. Come on then, let's recap. So, we can basically throw Nintendo out of the way early because they didn't have a press conference. Instead, they held a Nintendo Direct broadcast online and surprised precisely nobody by announcing another Smash Bros. Game and a new entry in the Mario Kart franchise. Actually, they did have a few pretty cool things, mainly gameplay footage of already announced titles. Specifically, I'm talking about the beautiful and intriguing X from Xenoblade Chronicles developers and Nintendo first-party group Monolith Soft. There was also Bayonetta 2, which managed a concerted act of trolling last year with its Wii U exclusivity, and had some reasonably cool clips thrust at us. There was also The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, which pretty well nobody had been expecting. Needless to say, Nintendo thrives on nostalgia dollars, and a sequel to A Link to the Past is certainly a good way of bringing them in, though one more churlish than me could question why there was all of one major new IP on show. Still, that's the way of things, isn't it? The sun rises and sets, the tide goes in and out, Nintendo fans complain that there aren't enough new IPs. Oh, and Mario can now dress as a cat, and there are fairy Pokemon, more on those later. Sony's offering was dense and long, and so here it is summarised very quickly. The Order 1886 tech demo by Dream Quantic, then infamous Second Son and a new Killzone will be done, a bunch of boasts on PS Vita, the barely sold store shelf Space Eater, Outlast and other zombie games, knacks for kids and looks quite lame, another Oddworld, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy, the 15th part, Ascreed 4 and Watch Dogs 2, which looks too good to quite be true, LeBron James digitally rendered an online game of Scrolls Quite Elder, Mad Max on PS4 is back, except the accents which it lacks. Jack Tretton puts one up the Xbone, he says it's fine to play games pre-owned. Oh, and prices announced for PS4, you can pick one up for £3, 4, 9. Microsoft, meanwhile, managed to sink themselves deeper into the quagmire the Xbone churned up for itself by announcing a launch price of $499 and packing the machine with completely unoriginal ideas ranging from the Call of Duty of the Roman Empire, catchily entitled Rise, Son of Rome. As you can see from this open quotes thrilling gameplay footage, it revolves around quick-time events and slog. It's a whole new kind of bland. As for the rest of the presentation, you can probably sing along by this point. Non-game functionality that nobody cares about but which inexplicably takes up 40% of the show, a new Halo, a mech shooter called Titanfall that actually looks vaguely fun but is taking on the unenviable task of being an MMO with a story, another Killer Instinct, a Metal Gear Solid game that was so dull they had to fast forward through half the footage, and some early DLC for Battlefield 4 as an incentive for people to buy the Xbone, a strategy I'm not happy to say probably worked. With the launch price so high and an almost total lack of interest in games, with the admirable exception of the powerful yet simple Project Spark, a game creator available for Windows 8 and Xbox One, Microsoft's was easily the worst presentation at the show. Still, it would be remiss to cover E3 without mentioning the other conferences. For some reason, EA decided that Plants and Zombies needed another sequel, and here it is in all its weird 3D glory. Garden Warfare seems to be a rather different affair to the earlier games, with movable characters engaging in what looks more like Left 4 Dead than anything in its own franchise. I'm now contractually obliged by the Bad Joke Union to say that it looks tree-rific. Battlefield is of course EA's challenge to the Call of Duty juggernaut, and to its credit it has always managed to be the marginally more enjoyable game. Still, that doesn't stop the fact that there seems to have been very little innovation between Battlefields 3 and 4. I suppose it's to be expected. We're reaching the point where further graphical fidelity isn't really much more possible than minor tweaking, and the changes in technology over the last 2 years have been much smaller than from 2004, when Battlefield 2 came out, to 2011's Battlefield 3. There was the unveiling of Mirror's Edge 2, which is actually pretty exciting, given how great the first one was. One small problem is that they've called it Mirror's Edge. I would go on an extended rant, but firstly I've already been on one, and secondly you can already see my issue. If not, refer to last year's bit about Need for Speed Most Wanted. Still, we get to learn the origin story of Faith, and if it involves kicking more riot police in the head, I'll be like a kid in a candy store full of bullets. Oh, and Peggle 2. Peggle's pretty addictive actually. Now I need to go away and play Peggle. Lastly, but not leastly, there was Ubisoft, who after the surprise reveal of Watch Dogs last year managed to distinctly unimpress. They brought us a decent look at Assassin's Creed 4, which is notable only for having pirates, which is cool, and whaling, which isn't. The lore of the series escapes me by this point, but you'll be hard-pressed to find anyone who wouldn't enjoy running around slitting up some 18th century colonial types while dressed like Jack Sparrow. Oh, and there was more Watch Dogs stuff, a look at South Park The Stick of Truth and Splinter Cell Blacklist, in which a morally questionable man commits war crimes in the name of a brutal imperialist mission. Happy holidays! Besides E3, a heck of a lot else was released in June. There was the dystopian science fiction game Remember Me, which had wonderful combat and world building but was slightly let down by a rubbish story based on editing people's memories. There was Animal Crossing New Leaf, which it seems ate up millions of man-hours worldwide as people took to cultivating their curiously featureless little towns, like a zen rock garden filled with talking animals. Company of Heroes 2 was a strange choice to release in late June since it takes place during the Russian winter, but it seems to have been really popular anyway. Unusually for a real-time strategy game, it employed temperature as a mechanic to make sure players get really annoyed when their last squad freezes to death just as they capture an enemy flag. Comedy game Deadpool made a mediocre splash, and Ride to Hell Retribution may be a candidate for worst game to ever see widespread release, but the really big story of June was a little PS3 game called The Last of Us. The Last of Us has been in development for years and could well be called a swan song for the PS3 given its level of polish, focus on story and character, and chilling horror sequences. It doesn't quite match the level of character brutalization achieved by Tomb Raider, but seeing a naive girl travelling with a grizzled middle-aged guy who's lost his entire family through the spore-infected wastes of the former United States, set upon by slavering beasts the whole way, only for them to become as beastly as the enemies they purport to oppose, might put you off your ice cream sundae. It received rave reviews and topped many critics' Game of the Year lists come December, and it's fairly safe to say The Last of Us will go down with Crash Bandicoot as one of Naughty Dog's crowning achievements. Still, it wouldn't do to forget another game which passed June widely unnoticed, but which arguably deserves to be played just as much. Gunpoint was a sprite-based 2D stealth game developed by an absurdly small team in Game Maker and starring one Richard Conway, a private detective hired to investigate industrial espionage, police incompetence, and murder. Mr. Conway has several gadgets at his disposal, including trousers that let him jump absurdly high, and the game is almost as acrobatic as it is stealthy. He can also rewire circuits, allowing him to kill lights, deactivate alarms, and electrocute guards. Avoiding being shot on sight by security, Conway has to sneak into buildings, causing as little disruption as possible and steal, hack, or assassinate a specific target before making good his escape. It's only 2 hours long, but a level editor provides a lot of entertainment, and it's now very cheap on Steam. Well worth checking out. July was typical of the summer lull in that the release schedule was as dry as Oscar Wilde wandering around Death Valley, but for those of us interested in gaming's storied past, the release of Earthbound on the Virtual Console was enough to satiate our desires. If you're at all interested in gaming history or just plain funny, inventive, clever RPGs with fantastic soundtracks, there's nobody else on the internet who'll give you a more ringing endorsement than I will. Earthbound tells the story of Ness, a boy from the fictional town of Onit who discovers his latent psychic powers after a meteor containing an alien bee crashes near his house. The story at no point gets any more sane. Along the way, he'll be joined by another psychic girl, an Eastern prince, and an unpowered kid who is nevertheless a dab hand with rockets, as they team up to fight an unknowably terrible space alien in robot suits in the past. Told you it was weird. The groundswell of support for the revival of the Mother games has been staggering, and through 18 years, almost my entire lifespan, the fanbase has continued to pledge their support for this incredible series. The original Mother was an oddly bleak tale compared to the vibrant cartoon world of Earthbound. It was sparsely populated, dull-coloured, and focused a lot on the concepts of parenthood and friendship, behind the exterior series staples of smoking crows and zombie attacks. It was actually fully translated, albeit with significant changes, into English in 1990, but by that point the NES was on its last legs and was not deemed viable to mass produce. Come 1994 though, and the situation had changed. Buoyed by the success of the SNES, as well as the quirky style and the fact that RPGs were beginning to gain ground in the West, Nintendo saw fit to give Earthbound the full works. A large box was produced to fit the included strategy guide, and full-page magazine adverts proudly and punnily declared that this game stinks. It was an absolute failure. Earthbound sold only 400,000 copies and was never even brought to Europe or Australia. This July finally changed that. After a generation of campaigning, Wii U owners everywhere in the world could finally experience this masterpiece on their gamepads. Nintendo even uploaded the strategy guide in digital form, and you can't say fairer than that. If you liked Pikmin, and let's face it, who didn't, you would have been pleased going into August, as Pikmin 3 hit Wii U and set about being enormously fun. The in-game days are still frustratingly short, but switching between multiple characters and cool new types of Pikmin in a beautiful rendered world more than made up for it. It's easily one of the best games currently available for Nintendo's new system, and for a while at least managed to drive their usually sluggish sales figures. The Tales series came back again with a bog-standard entry in Tales of Xillia, which for all its length and fun combat doesn't really warrant further mention. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons was one of those indie games that has a heart-rending story of family ties to tell but was left slightly wanting in the gameplay department. Then Nintendo released another solid game in the form of Mario & Luigi Dream Team, or Dream Team Bros as it was known in Europe for reasons as yet unexplained. Mario and Luigi, in typical RPG fashion, travel to a strange land, and this time have the ability to travel through the more Green Brothers' unconscious brain as a way of proceeding through the story. It was an interesting mechanic, but still didn't recapture the glory of the first Mario and Luigi game from 2003. The thought-provoking interactive fiction of Gone Home was followed by the slightly less thought-provoking Killer is Dead, a Suda51 game in name and style. It followed a futuristic executioner named, of all things, Mondo Zappa, and that really tells you all you need to know. After considerable delays, Rayman Legends finally landed at the beginning of September, and shed its Wii U exclusivity, probably in the name of the almighty dollar. Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs made us soil our collective underwear, and Kingdom Hearts saw itself re-released to the eternal squealing of teenage fangirls. Puppeteer showed off every feature of the PS3 that nobody uses, namely Move and 3D, in a surprisingly fun game that, despite its resemblance to Little Big Planet, managed to earn a lot of praise in its own right. The game everyone else cared about in September, though, was Grand Theft Auto V, the gloriously violent sandbox game in which murder carries surprisingly light penalties and nobody locks their cars. Playing as three characters who, like star-crossed lovers, see their paths converge for a series of heists, the vast explorable world offered hundreds of hours of entertainment for the discerning explosives enthusiast who also likes driving in the desert and riding roller coasters. It pretty predictably managed to shatter all sorts of sales records and, along with Saints Row 4, ushered sandboxes back to the forefront of gaming fame, and rightly so. Having said that, it did of course raise the usual questions about its depictions of women, which obviously Rockstar will do nothing about, but which needed to be asked anyway. The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker HD was released a week later and, despite the incredibly long title, deservedly received high praise for making improvements to a game that was already near perfect. Despite the lamentable absence of the Tingle Tuner, the graphical changes which made the Great Sea look glorious and the Miiverse functionality being very fun made people very fond of this installment in the Zelda series. Oh, and Link can take selfies, which you may think is cute, but which this particular curmudgeon thinks ruins the whole thing for everyone forever. Rain made its invisible debut on PS3 at the beginning of October and received some pretty mediocre coverage, despite its wonderful soundtrack and premise. Other noteworthy but not big games of this month included Guitar Lesson Simulator Rocksmith 2014, Embarrassment Generator Just Dance 2014, and the mind-screwy but hilarious standalone version of the Stanley Parable. But of course, this month was going to be given over to the 5 massive releases that took place. Beyond Two Souls proved that Heavy Rain was the exception rather than the rule in being actually good rather than self-indulgent, incoherent and irritating like Beyond and Quantic Dream's other well-known game Fahrenheit. It often felt like it had been put together by a team of writers given basic character outlines and sealed in different rooms with a slowly diminishing air supply. In short, it went beyond the pale. Pokemon X and Y added another stack of monsters to the already teetering pile, and if reactions are anything to go by, it seems to have glued fans to their 3DSs like some sort of military adhesive. Tons of new features were added, like the cutesy Pokemon Ami, which lets you use your Pikachu as a sort of Nintendog. As previously mentioned, Fairy Pokemon made their debut and brought the number of types up to 18. Anyone who yells which types dragons are weak to at the screen right now wins a prize. Batman Arkham Origins gave you new and prequely ways to beat up masked baddies in a gloomy setting, as Black Mask commissioned the world's greatest assassins to take out Batman. You can probably guess who wins in the end, although the handheld version for Vita and 3DS left a lot to be desired. Assassin's Creed 4 and Battlefield 4 released on the same day in a spectacular cock-up by the planning departments. One is a bloody adventure set partially on the high seas in which dangerous rogues fight the forces of imperialist aggression in foreign climates. The other is Assassin's Creed 4. Do you see what I did there? Seriously though, they were pretty well received, and despite the protestations of Peter over the whaling issue, EA and Ubisoft can give themselves great big self-congratulatory pats on the back, as I'm sure they constantly do anyway. The prize for most stupid release of the month goes inevitably to the Nintendo 2DS, a cheaper non-3D version of their flagship handheld designed for families with young children. Featuring a flat face with no breakable hinges, the design isn't what you'd call tremendously attractive, even if the idea deserves merit. If they'd launched it on April 1st, it wouldn't have looked out of place amongst the jokes, and I really can't imagine sales have been astronomical. November opened with the launch of another game about how Americans are great, foreigners are devils, and woo-woo flag shooty Republican Party bang bang NRA racist fun. Yes, Call of Duty Ghosts, the most notable feature of which was the addition of a dog. The less said about that, the better. There wasn't much to talk about in terms of games this month, but that's okay because it was all about the hardware. The Sony PlayStation 4 was followed a week later by the Xbox One, and all eyes were on the sales figures, which rocketed skywards at apparently the fastest rate of sales ever on the first day of release. Xbox One seemed to have got over or covered up its massive PR difficulties, and the PS4 launch went pretty much without a hitch. The ever-kind 4chan got in on the act by creating a guide to activating backwards compatibility on the Xbone, which actually led to the console being bricked. Quite why a console still has the developer mode accessible on the release edition is not quite known, so demerits for humanity on both sides here. So far the PS4 is leading on sales, but we'll see if their apparent surge continues or if the great green monster will claw back some market share. Or you know, you could always buy a PC. Except for Minecraft's much delayed appearance on PlayStation Network and the second season of Telltale's excellent The Walking Dead adaptation, December was actually pretty dry for games. But that's okay because it gives me a chance to wrap up this review of the year with some year-long trends and special mentions. The 3DS continued its dominance over the PS Vita, with the sales gap widening to a rather staggering 35 million. The Nintendo handheld hegemony seems to be keeping the Wii U afloat too, now that it's not doing tremendously well in sales or games. The Wii won the 7th generation with over 100 million sales, and the PS3 just scraped in ahead of the Xbox 360 despite the latter's year-long head start. We saw the end of a console era which gave us dozens of fantastic games, the rise of the shooter and sandbox, and the resurgence of the adventure game. We lost franchises like Guitar Hero but gained Left 4 Dead, Xenoblade Chronicles, Flower, and The Walking Dead. Is the gaming world better for it? Who knows? But one thing is for sure, and that's that we've got a hell of a lot more to look forward to. My personal game of the year was... well, that's hard to decide. That's not for a lack of good games either, there were just so many I couldn't pick from among them all. I had tons of fun with Gunpoint, Bioshock Infinite, Tomb Raider, Monaco, What's Yours Is Mine, and Ride to Hell, only joking. But I'm sure there's a lot I missed out, and you'll all revel in telling me so in the comments. It's been one eventful year, but now we've got to look ahead. To new experiences, to great stories, to expanding the scope and influence of gaming as an art form higher and broader than it has ever reached before, and to killing lots of zombies. Thanks for watching, and Happy New Year.